when this was bought in Paris in 1935. I was staying at the Hotel Lancaster. They telephoned from downstairs at the hall porter and said, the two skirts are here. I said, skirts? I didn't order any skirts. And you know what they were? They were extra skirts that came with the statue.
The Little Dancer by Degas belongs to one of the world's most discreet collectors, Henry McIlhenny.
And I always have had this terrific acquisitive urge. I can't resist buying things. It's a disease. You know, Renoir said, all collectors are harmless maniacs.
180 people who were screened, only these three were chosen by both sides.
And they really are marvelous.
Yeah.
They just were so clever.
Henry McIlhenny is an established figure in Philadelphia society. His parties are very stylish and very selective. The invitation says black tie, and why not, when all around, on every wall, only a few feet away, hang some of the great paintings of the world.
No, they were mine in Ireland. The Duchess of Aragon.
And if the host takes it all for granted, the guests still find time to pay tribute to the local masterpieces.
I'm sorry that one doesn't seem to be going to the Van Gogh show. The Van Gogh is such an unusual one.
A painting of rain by Van Gogh.
See, the Van Gogh show is just I think, isn't it the compound behind the hospital at Saint-Denis?
I think it is.
And the Met show is
It's the
just
only one that's ever, anybody except the Japanese has painted of rain. And it's absolutely fascinating when you look at it.
I think it's a very moving picture, and he painted it from the insane asylum in Saint-Denis, where he was being kept for a while. And I went there a few years ago with Natasha Spender, and I couldn't get into the room because there was an inmate. So it might have been quite dangerous and alarming. But the field isn't exactly the way it looks in the painting, because a house has been built and a row of cypress trees, and the rest of the field is nothing but lavender and rosemary. So it's still quite a beautiful place.
The theme of the McIlhenny collection is 19th century French art. Here, in the drawing room, side by side, are the faces of France in all their moods, from the soft impressionist look of a Renoir to the proud classical gaze of an Ingres. Great painting that is part of the furniture.
Those pictures were painted for use in houses, so they made more sense than a religious picture that should have been in a church. Also, in the 30s, there was a terrific possibility to buy good examples by these artists because they were simply available and on the market. Or as if I'd thought to myself, I wanted Italian Renaissance pictures. First, I couldn't have afforded them, and then Botticelli's weren't lying around by the dozen.
In France, the 19th century begins with David, the master of classical art. Painting, like politics, was in turmoil. It followed no set pattern. Instead, there were extreme contrasts in theory and technique, in style and school. Drawings by Toulouse-Lautrec and Cézanne almost touch. The Impressionists changed art forever. Superb draftsmen who revolutionized painting. Degas, Pissarro, Matisse.
What sort of collector are you? Do you decide immediately, or do you go home and really reflect and come back a few times?
Oh no, I decide immediately.
Have you always done that?
Always.
You've never had a second thought?
No. I think you just instinctively know what you want.
Philadelphia is one of America's oldest cities, despite the row of skyscrapers. One spire gives it all away. In 1787, here in Independence Hall, the American Constitution was written and a new country was born. But every year the new replaces the old, even in Rittenhouse Square, the heart of 19th century Philadelphia. Giant buildings dwarf the old brick houses. Henry McIlhenny bought 3 in a row. This impressive front door is only used for parties. The real entrance is more discreet.
He's the president of the Chicago Art Institute, is he? Or chairman of the board, really.
Henry McIlhenny has spent rather than made a fortune. He was born rich.
My grandfather was born in Ireland, invented a gas meter, and it really had the monopoly. And he moved from Columbus, Georgia, where he was the mayor for 20 years after the Civil War, and came to Philadelphia. And my aunts all spoke with definite Georgia accents, and they hated the movement from the south to the north, because I think they were nobody up here. But as the mayor's daughters in a small town, they had lovely life.
Did he hope that you would go into this family business?
No. I think he knew at the beginning that I was not that type.
It was a happy childhood, restricted only by the Victorian morality of his parents.
They were very strict Presbyterians, at least my father was, being what they call Scotch-Irish in America, but Ulster Scot in the British Isles. And I was made to go to church every Sunday. And we weren't allowed Sunday newspapers. Of course, I went and read them in the maids' rooms, because I loved the funnies. Just as Picasso loved the Katzenjammer kids, you know, was thrilled by them. And there was no music and no card playing on a Sunday. And it was rather dour.
He grew up with art. Both his parents were collectors. The Renaissance furniture and Persian carpets of his childhood were given to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where his father served as president. For over 30 years, he himself was curator of decorative arts. Today, he is chairman of the board and presides at acquisition meetings.
And why this museum should acquire such a work of art.
Well, as you know, we have the largest collection of Dutch paintings of the 17th century in the United States, more than 250 examples. But we have a conspicuous omission in having so few Dutch Italianate paintings. The painting under consideration is by Jan Baptist Weenix, who went to Italy in 1642 or 43. This is probably the rest on the flight into Egypt. And we can probably date it to about 1650, based on pictures like this one in a private collection, which was on loan to our Dutch genre painting show, and which is dated 1647, the year of his return, a very tender subject.
I personally like it a great deal. I think the baby has an inflated tummy, but perhaps that's only a temporary disorder.
At Harvard, he learnt about art from 1930 to 1934. His student dream was to work in a museum and to collect. But first, he spent 3 carefree years as an undergraduate.
I lived in a place called Dunster House, which is really very attractive, and overlooked the Charles River. And you could see all the people going by in sculls. Not that I wanted to row a scull, but I used to watch them suffering in the cold.
As a postgraduate, he met Agnes Mongan, a specialist in Old Master drawings. Their friendship goes back over 50 years. In 1933, at the Fogg Institute, he took the museum course, the first of its kind. Drawings were high on the agenda because his teacher, Paul Sachs, was not only a scholar, but also an avid collector.
Well, he was a remarkable man and very, very, very dynamic. And I think most of us were a little bit intimidated by him because he had a rather sharp tongue. But nevertheless, we all loved him, I think, at the same time.
He was a born teacher, and he would, well, when he took the museum, gave the museum course, and we all assembled in that long living room up in Shady Hill, and he would get up and take a small object off the bookcases which surrounded the room. Whatever it was, he'd say, look at it. Now, is it a work of art? Why? Do you like it? Does it speak to you? What does it say? And we would all look very hard. And if you look very hard with that intensity, you have strong opinions.
So he gave you the feeling that things were able to be acquired. They weren't just dead, like frescoes in a church that you couldn't possibly get hold of. He made them feel available and possessible. He advised all of us not to buy higgledy-piggledy all over the map. He said it's much better to concentrate on one field and develop that.
Encouraged by Paul Sachs, he bought his first painting when he was still at Harvard. In 1934, he paid $30,000 for this oil by the 18th century French artist Chardin. At the same time, he bought his first drawing, a nude by Corot.
Paul Sachs was a visiting professor in 33 in Paris, and he saw that drawing at a dealer's, and he loved it. And he sent me a photograph of it and said, get the Fogg to get it. And the Fogg couldn't because it was too expensive. And I got in touch with Henry.
And I said, well, Agnes, how much is it? And she told me, and I said, I'll buy it.
Where did you hang the Corot and the Chardin?
Oh, well, I didn't put the Chardin in my room in Dunster House, I must confess. But there I did have the Corot drawing. I had the Seurat drawing, La Parade. And all my contemporaries thought I was out of my mind.
Why?
Well, they thought they were bunk, junk, because
Really?
nobody else was buying them.
There was no turning back. He wanted more, and more was across the Atlantic. He knew Europe well.
We used to have to go by ship, but I loved ships. They were wonderful. And then we would just go to cities like London or Paris, and my parents were indefatigable sightseers. The Baedeker was never out of their hand. And they went to dealers, of course, as well.
In 1935, his father dead, he travelled to Europe with his widowed mother. She had spent a lifetime satisfying her own taste. Now it was her son's turn. He was the apple of her eye.
Of course, I was a spoilt brat, because when I wanted something, she often would simply give it to me. And one afternoon in Paris, she gave me two pictures, The Little Girl by Renoir and the Delacroix Sardanapalus. So I was not as much dominated by my mother as I dominated her, in a sense, in getting her to buy things for me. And then she developed a terrific urge to have them too.
Sardanapalus orders the execution of his harem, by Delacroix. Mademoiselle Legrand by Renoir. Unlike today, in the 1930s, French paintings were still to be found in Paris.
I went to all the dealers because that's part of the fun. I know certain collectors that only will go to one dealer because they feel secure or they trust them. But I think the great sport was to go to Rosenberg, Wildenstein, you name it, and look and see what they all offered.
He bought to please himself. French Impressionists were not expensive. In 1935, he paid $42,000 for this major work, The Dance at the Moulin Rouge by Toulouse-Lautrec.
I was in Paris with some Harvard classmates the summer of 1933, the year I graduated, and I went to a dealer called Arnold Seligman, who didn't go in for 19th century paintings at all. It was earlier things and decorative arts. And the big fat man who was in charge, Paul Bick, said, oh, you know, you might be interested in one of Arnold Seligman's private collection because he died. So he showed me this picture. And of course, I was wild to have it. And if you can believe it, they sent it on approval. So it arrived in the house I used to live in, and it looked so marvelous, and is really one of his finest examples. And so it was bought.
Was your mother's reaction as enthusiastic as yours?
Well, perhaps not. But I think she couldn't help but like it.
And did she, in fact, pay for it?
Oh, yes. That was very important.
Was the Moulin Rouge a brothel?
Oh, no, it was a nightclub in Montmartre. And I think a lot of people went there. But I suppose that a lot of the people that went were rather louche. I mean, it wasn't a Quaker meeting or anything. And a lot of the people in the painting can be identified. That woman who's dancing is meant to be La Goulou. And then the man is called Valentin le Dessaussé, because he was so limber, it looked as though he had no bones. And there were famous dancers in that period. And then a great many of the people in the background can be identified because he painted separate portraits of them that still exist. I think that it's a marvelously exciting composition, and it's full of action and gaiety. I think the woman is magnificent in the pink dress. And the odd thing is that nobody knows who she was. She's completely anonymous, which is strange.
Was there such a thing as a budget for your collecting?
Oh, no.
So money was no problem to you?
Well, not particularly, although it was the worst of the Depression. Fortunately, we seem to be well enough healed at the moment. Now we're what they call impoverished millionaires.
The accent is on millionaires. At the head of a highly trained household is Patrick Gallagher, the butler. And his wife, Noreen. They make sure that standards don't slip. In life, as in art, everything must be perfect, especially the flowers.
Those two carnations ought to go either side.
Okay, that's good.
That's where we usually have them. That looks rather pretty. Professor Sachs said once that any art man that didn't like good food and drink was suspect. And if you're sensitive visually, You also ought to be sensitive about everything else.
Seriously. I don't know why they couldn't have done it.
Are you going to have some red?
Yes.
Do you want red wine or not?
Do you want some red?
Please.
You can see it in the garden, hear it in the waterfall. You can feel it in the people, how they care for it all. You can see it in the smiles, in the shops and the cafes. At Peachtree Plaza, we're here to help you in 1,000 different ways.
Welcome to Atlanta's Westin Peachtree Plaza, the world's tallest hotel. In a little over a minute, you will reach the sundial.
Atlanta, Georgia, burnt to the ground in the Civil War. Today, it rises up in all its skyscraper majesty, one of the fastest growing cities of the South. The High Museum of Art was built by the distinguished American architect Richard Meyer, and here for the first time, the Henry McIlhenny collection is on show to the public.
I'm in shock. It's just so unusual to be studying about them, for so long, and then to actually come and see the real thing, it gives you goosebumps.
It's always rather a shock when you see your things somewhere else. Several museums asked me if I would lend my collection to them. The fact that my father was born in Georgia meant that I had a Southern connection. The other institutions, although perfectly worthy, I had no possible connection with. And I wanted to see the new High Museum because it sounded rather exciting from an architectural viewpoint. And I also thought that that new building would have all the latest equipment, etc. And also I wanted to go look at it myself.
He's got Degas and Renoirs and Cézanne. He's got everything. It's just a huge collection of great things.
I think it's a marvelous collection of late 19th century art. The artists are some of my favorite artists, and obviously had a very keen eye and astute judgment when he collected these.
I thought they hung it extremely well, and I thought they lit it very well too. Although I think that a lot of pictures are better when they're not against a dead white background. A lot of cream or just a little?
A little bit.
There you are. Now you must help yourself. If you want more milk, you can put it in.
Thank you. Can you remember the actual day that you first saw that Matisse?
Yes. In the spring of 1933, I went to a dealer in New York.
When you were still a student?
Yes. Yes, it was my last year at college. And I went to the dealer on my way home. I stopped off in New York, and there this picture was. It had just come from a sale in Paris, and I immediately wanted it. But I bought a head of Matisse from the same dealer, and I decided that I would exchange that. So he gave me credit for the head that I'd bought, and gave me this picture instead. And I'll always remember the date, because it was just when Roosevelt was inaugurated, and he closed all the banks. So the dealer called me up and said, but I can't cash your check. Well, I said, that's not my fault. You'll just have to wait till the banks reopen, because I have enough money in my account. So I know that that was in March 1933. I liked it particularly because it was so fresh in color. And I thought it was a beautiful composition. And I've never been tired of it. I think it's a beautiful thing. The fruit is so lovely, and the flowers. And a lot of people think the pineapple's rather funny, but when they know that it's a candied pineapple, it makes quite a difference.
It was in Paris that he first got to know Matisse.
My French was a little bit too primitive, but I certainly could converse with Matisse, and he told me some very, very funny stories about when he came to the Barnes Foundation, because Dr. Barnes was determined that Matisse had a venereal disease. And he made poor Papa Matisse go to the hospital here for a complete physical checkup. And he said it was really terrifying because I didn't speak English, and they did all these dreadful things to me. But he said, when I got out, I knew exactly what the result would be, negatif.
In 1941, the gilded life came to a stop. America joined the war, and Henry McIlhenny enlisted.
I went into the Navy, which wasn't too hard to get a commission if you were a Harvard graduate. And so I went to an indoctrination school with 500 other people, all alphabetically bunked, and it was really rather deadly. And then I was, after the school, I was sent to a squadron of aircraft at a place called Cherry Point, North Carolina, which I'd never heard. And I went to report, and there was the captain of the aircraft squadron sitting on his bed, getting undressed. And I went through the maneuver of saying, Lieutenant Junior Grade McIlhenny reporting for duty, sir. And he gave me an icy glare. He was called Captain Yoho, Y-O-H-O. And he said, what did you do in civilian life? And I said, I was a curator in an art museum. And I think if he hadn't been seated, he would have fallen down with shock. And then he said, there's another officer coming from Quonset Point. I hope he wasn't a music critic.
Did you see action in the war?
Oh, yes. I went to all the best engagements in the Pacific.
After the war, grandson of an Irishman, he went back to his roots and to a castle that he had bought in the 30s, Glenveigh in Donegal. The gardens, which he transformed, became his work of art. Every summer he settled here and entertained his friends with typical extravagance.
Very wild, very uninhabited, and I think of an extreme natural beauty, but a little bit barren and bleak. It wasn't for everybody. I just decided that I would collect works of art that had deer in them because it made it more specialized and made it more amusing to have deer paintings when wild deer were scampering around on the hills and roaring at the mating season. And so I just began to buy things with deer in them.
Not surprisingly, he was drawn to Sir Edwin Landseer, master of the wild.
I really do sincerely think that Landseer could be, and was, a great many times, an extremely distinguished artist. And I think now, after years and years and years of neglect, people are really beginning to appreciate him at his best moments.
In 1981, he spent his last summer at Glenveigh. He gave the castle to the Irish government, never to return.
It was a terrible wrench and rather traumatic, but I just felt that the time had come to leave Ireland, not only because of the troubles and you couldn't expect not to have some sort of a backlash, because my place was so near the border, only 35 miles from Londonderry and from Strabane, where there seems to be constant friction and horror going on. Then Ireland became extremely costly to run, and I was getting older, and the climate's rather terrible. Rains too much, and it's too cold and too damp. And I just thought the moment had come to make a break.
How marvelous! Heavens, well, what's this? I can hardly wait to see it. Oh, how fascinating. It's a painting of Glenveigh. Makes me homesick. That's marvelous. Oh, thank you very much, dear. How lovely. Oh, I adore that.
Impressionists were very involved with the way light moved across things. We find in this painting what we think of as an Impressionist palette of very pastel kind of colors. And rather than relying on line to define objects, forms are built up not by outlining them and filling them in with...
It is really one of his loveliest streetscapes, I think, that he painted, although he did others that are terribly good. But I think this is enchanting, and I thought it was a good thing to have because it shows Impressionism, which you also find in Sisley, Pissarro, and Monet. But here it seems to me that Renoir has the same qualities.
Les Grands Boulevards. It's just a boulevard. That's Impressionism. The lamppost.
I think Deborah said this was her favorite one.
I don't like this one as much.
We do have this flat decorative patterning here, which shows an influence that the Impressionists shared from Japanese prints, which first came into France as wrapping paper, I understand, around China. And they sort of unwrapped this as you might wrap something in your newspaper and said, hey, this image is really nice here. And we can see the influence in work of many of the Impressionist painters.
I was longing to possess it because I think it is a very, very good example of Renoir's work. And I think it's so charming. And it was the year that he seemed to be at his best powers, 1875. I like the adorable quality of the little girl because I think she's ravishingly sweet. And I think also that it's a beautiful color. I like that sort of peacock blue.
I think you could put her in a sweatshirt and blue jeans and she would be today. I like it very much. I have 2 daughters, so I appreciate her.
I don't really like his late works. They're too messy. I think those great blobs of flesh are rather revolting at times. I remember once in Paris, a rather late Renoir from Drouin was sent to the hotel to have it there, and Matisse came to look at it. And he pointed out a weakness in the picture that I hadn't really seen.
What was that?
Well, just a weakness of drawing and composition, and it really turned me off the picture to have Matisse disapprove of it.
He prizes his drawings as much as his paintings. In pencil, the classical artist Ingres reigns supreme. Also classical in feel, and certainly influenced by Ingres, is this drawing by Théodore Chassériau, dated 1847. Toulouse-Lautrec was only 19 when he did this charcoal sketch of a friend.
Well, I think drawings are very much more spontaneous, usually, than the final painting, Because after all, most artists made sketches for them. And often the sketches are more alluring than the final work, which might be a little bit stiff. If you have one major work by somebody like Toulouse-Lautrec, it's amusing to have something else as well. It shows two different sides of their craftsmanship. I think it's charming because it's a self-portrait, and it's nothing. It's just a scrap of paper. But it shows how deformed he was and how short. And he was an extraordinary little man. And I love it for that reason.
19th century classical art is not everyone's cup of tea, but for those who do like it, the master of technique is Ingres. His subject, the Countess of Tournon.
I think that she was really a nasty woman. She went out to Rome, where her son was under the aegis of Napoleon, and I think she must have ruined the poor boy's winter. And it was in 1812, and I think he probably was delighted to get rid of her all day when she was posing for Ingres. I love the paisley shawl, the way the whole thing is done. But of course, she was ugly as sin. Portraits can be very beautiful works of art. And I myself have always been more interested in figures than I have been in landscapes.
What do you see?
Drab colors.
Drabby? Okay.
Drab colors.
Drab.
Space.
Do you see color?
I said drab colors.
Okay, drab colors.
The Romantic Face by François-Xavier Fabre.
Sad.
Sad? Okay. Sad maybe.
Well, not really sad. I mean, peaceful. I mean, just...
I'll put the two down if she says anything, then I'm not gonna worry about it.
Okay.
The compelling genius of Cézanne.
I immediately thought it was the most marvelous, monumental thing. I think that it's very noble and rather more sensitive and more Lotto-like than most of his portraits of Madame Cézanne, who really must have had a very hard time with him.
Why do you say that?
Oh, she had to pose so often, and he was so slow. And when he was doing fruit, apparently they would rot practically before he got through with them. And so I think sometimes he had to use artificial fruit. That may be nonsense. But the portraits of Madame Cézanne are usually rather depressing. But he did paint her a couple of times in this same striped blouse. And I always feel that the picture, in my mind, is bigger than it really is in actuality, because I think it is very monumental. And I love the line of her head. Another thing that's nice about that picture, it's never been varnished. So you get this lovely matte effect. And a lot of Cézanne's weren't varnished, and I don't think they should be, because he didn't do it.
When the French public first saw this in 1881, there was an outcry. Putting a skirt on a statue was revolutionary. For Henry McIlhenny, this artist, Edgar Degas, sculptor, draftsman, and painter, is his personal favorite.
All of a sudden, I just did realize that I liked Degas the best, because he hardly ever let you down. And he was such a fantastically good draftsman. And then I always have liked his subject matter as well.
He drew and painted this man many times, the ballet master. One of the earliest and most mysterious paintings is called Interior.
But Ref, in his book on Degas, says, and I think that may be true, that it's based on a novel by Zola, Thérèse Raquin. And it does somehow match a scene in that novel. It's very unpleasant. Thérèse was married, And she had a lover, the man on the right of the canvas, and they decided to drown her husband to get rid of him, which I must say seems an awkward method of killing somebody, but they did it. And then they decided they couldn't be seen together or speak because people might suspect them. So 2 years later, her mother-in-law said, "You're a much too young a girl to be a widow all your life. Why don't you marry your old," whatever he was. And so they did get married. And when they got married, they found they hated each other's guts. And apparently he was meant to come back to their room with a knife to kill her, and she was meant to have prepared poison. So they both took the poison, and they were found dead by the mother-in-law the next morning.
In a more light-hearted mood, he sketched his friend, the American painter Mary Cassatt, at the Louvre.
When I saw the picture, I couldn't, of course I wanted it just as a work of art, but it made it even more attractive because it was of a Pennsylvanian whose family lived in Philadelphia. I think it has terrific chic and style, the way she's leaning on the umbrella. I always wonder how she got into the Louvre, because nobody's been allowed to take an umbrella into a museum since the smashing of the Portland vase.
Why do you think Degas didn't paint her face?
I think she was homely. I'm afraid. There is a portrait of her, I think, full face or half face, and she isn't a beauty by a long shot.
He did this pastel in 1886 when he was going blind.
I don't think there were too many nudes of people drying themselves. That was rather original, I think. And he loved doing that. There are lots of wonderful bathtub pictures. When you look at it closely, the arm is covered with these vertical strokes of pastel. When you look at it from the distance, it's perfectly monumental and in the round.
Pope Pius VII by David is wheeled into store.
I liked it immediately because I think it's very monumental and handsome and impressive. But just because it was the Pope, I didn't particularly care, being a Protestant. But this man was an extremely interesting Pope. He was captured by Napoleon and really humiliated and kept a prisoner at Fontainebleau or wherever. And then when he went to crown Napoleon, Napoleon grabbed the crown himself.
Museum conservator Marge Harvey checks each painting.
With this raking light, I'm looking for any surface problem, such as flaking paint, an abrasion, or any kind of accretion that may have come to the painting in the time that it was on exhibit here. This particular painting is not in very good condition because the panel has the 3 cracks. And on either side of the cracks, there is flaking paint, which at this point is stabilized, but it has to be watched very, very carefully and closely.
Through the night, the collection is taken by truck to Philadelphia, into the back entrance of Rittenhouse Square.
You have to bring it up from. You have to grab it from the bottom now.
Here, the museum staff take over and put the paintings back where they belong.
Leaving on.
All right, you guys got it?
Okay, Slim, you have it?
But one great painting has left the collection forever.
Now, specifically, a few years ago, you sold a great Cézanne. At what moment did you decide that the Cézanne itself should be the picture to be sold?
The reason I sold that was, first, I knew it would bring a lot, which was important. Second, I'm leaving all my things to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and they already have a lot of Cézannes. And in the Barnes Foundation, there's something like 9 still lifes of the same period. So I'm not depriving the museum of anything that was basic to it. On the other hand, I think that the White Sugar Bowl is one of the most beautiful Cézanne still lifes, and it, in a way, broke my heart to sell it. But I just thought I wanted a luxurious senility. It brought nearly $4 million, but I got $3,600,000.
Now, was that what you expected?
I thought I might get a little more, but I suppose everybody's greedy. Now I'll have a little cash available. I expect to begin looking again. I would like to have something by Géricault, because I like him very much. And he was awfully important, historically speaking. I don't have a Manet, and that's a great loss. I would also like to have a good painting by Courbet, but I haven't seen one.
It just fell on. Of course. As soon as the ladder's touched.
And I just am used to having works of art around me. And I like them. They make the whole atmosphere and give me pleasure. Often at night, when I turn off the lights or something, I look at the pictures. But I don't go down there and sit wrapped in an ecstasy or anything. But I enjoy what I have.